Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, for some reason, we're going to be talking about the newest album from Cage the Elephant, titled Tell Me I'm Pretty. So I'll be the first to admit, there are some producers that tend to rub me the wrong way. And if you watch any of my rock or country reviews, you'll know the name that lists the top of my list is Jay Joyce. Most well known in the country sphere for working with Eric Church, and most specifically for that abortion of epic proportions known as The Outsiders. He's got a knack for a production that can have some impact with chunkier riffs and rougher edges, but it can lack some subtlety in the finer instrumental details, to put it lightly. Although, to be fair, he has gotten better. The funny thing is, you flip over to the rock side, there's also been a band he's been working with since the very beginning of their career, who've actually had some success on modern rock radio, and I don't think I've ever talked about before. Cage the Elephant. And I'll be honest here, I've always kind of been on the fence about this group, and that I really wish I liked them a lot more than I do. They got a knack for melody, and there are some broad strokes in their explosively messy sound that I do find appealing to go on with the occasional twisted lyrics to go with them, but they're also not exactly a subtle or altogether nuanced group. It has led to their past three records being good, even sometimes very good, but not quite great. Now, part of this was the gradual maturing of their singer-songwriter Matthew Schultz, which actually meant they were getting better with each subsequent album. As his early vocals had a nasal quality that got very grating, especially on their wilder, more punk-inspired second album, Thank You Happy Birthday. Now, things did improve the most on their third album, Melophobia, in 2013, which is a much thicker, heavier, more bluesy and psychedelic album, but despite a fair few great songs there were a lot of instrumental flourishes and genre shifts that didn't really go anywhere. And I wish we were a little bit more grounded or given more room to breathe, especially considering most of them served as outros that didn't really fit in with the rest of the songs. You wanted to make the transitions work, they were actually halfway decent, but I wanted to see that element fleshed out a little bit more if you're going to go in that proggier direction. Now, that being said, it was their most diverse, well-written, and well-structured album to date, and helped define their most unique sound, and it seemed like they had a good groove going into a future record, so naturally it made sense for them to pitch out their lead guitarist, Jay Joyce, to start working with the frontman of the Black Keys, Dan Auerbach, on production for their newest album. Now look, in theory, you could have seen this coming. Cage the Elephant had been working with the Black Keys, they toured with them, and moving more towards blues rock. Jay Joyce is busier than ever these days, they might not have been able to get him, and Dan Auerbach has handled production before. Unfortunately, the last thing that I covered that he produced was Lana Del Rey's Ultraviolence, not a good sign at all, and neither was the buzz suggesting that early singles from this album has shed away some of Cage the Elephant's newly defined sound in favor of sounding like the Black Keys, as if we needed more of that. But hey, this is my chance to evaluate if the compositional strength and writing can hold up under a different production environment. So I gave Tell Me I'm Pretty a lot of listens. Did we get anything good? Well, okay, it's not bad, but it's not that good either. And what I find frustrating is I don't think I can blame Dan Auerbach entirely for this, because the problems are across the board, from production to vocals to songwriting. I've gone through this album a number of times hoping that it would click with me, especially considering the styles of rock the Cage the Elephant draw upon for Tell Me I'm Pretty are the kind I like, but all that it reminds me of is that I could be listening to Temples or better, earlier Black Keys albums. In other words, I guess it's okay, but the more I've listened through it, the less I've liked it, and that's never a good sign. Probably not going to go back to it after this time of the year. Also kind of makes sense why they dumped it in this time of year. So let's start with the most obvious issues, the instrumentation and production. Now, what I found really refreshing about Melophobia, even though I criticized it, is not only that it improved that the band could write interesting and dynamic melodies, but they could handle transitions and take their songs in different, unexpected directions. The seeds of good ideas were there, and yet we roughly get only about half of that on this album. For the most part, the foundational melodies are good, sometimes even great, but it's rare the song shifts in a cool or unconventional or interesting direction. Just because some of the outros felt abortive on Melophobia didn't mean I wanted to get rid of them entirely, but flesh them out a little bit more, go for that more progressive side. And yet, with the exception of the tempo shift on Crybaby, that doesn't happen. Now, part of this I suspect was the recording process itself, where Dan Auerbach urged them to go rougher and rely more on first takes, which I'll say right now, that was a mistake, because most of these songs do not nearly develop as much as they should. Because look, there is a decent foundation here. The bass and drum grooves are pretty damn solid and actually pretty punchy across the board, and most of the guitar tones, they work too, even if there are points where the texture feels a little bit flat and overexposed to mesh in with the rest of the mix, specifically on Mess Around or Portuguese Knife Fight, or the more compressed riff on Too Late to Say Goodbye. But at the best, we get songs like Cold Cold Cold, easily my favorite song here for actually having a solid interweaving melodic riff and a great hook. Say nothing of the only guitar solo that lands with any sort of impact, and that I'm blaming on Auerbach, because for a band that actually had some southern muscle on Melophobia, to be stripped down to something this thin and wiry and honestly a little bit generic does nobody any favors. And just like on that last Black Keys album, Turn Blue the synthesizers are almost universally bad, weedy, oily, and adding nothing at all to the mix here. And that's not even getting to tracks like Trouble or How Are You True. Yeah, I love the Beatles as much as anybody, but am I the only one who hears somebody in the composition of Trouble, particularly in the rhythm section, and it gets incredibly distracting? I gotta be honest, Cage the Elephant are better than this. They're more creative than this. Granted, the vocals aren't helping. Now I'll lay my cards on the table here. I've never loved Matthew Schultz's voice, but when he sticks to his more brash, low to mid range and actually brings some aggression to the table, it works for me. And yet on this album, he spends so much of it in this crooning falsetto that is wispy and painfully underweight. Not helped by the compression on the vocal production like on Too Late to Say Goodbye, or when he sounds just half asleep like on most of That's Right. I get why you might try this. Again, it's an obvious Beatles callback to that era of rock, but when you have such meaty bass lines and pretty aggressive melodies, to have vocals so underweight and lacking in body to really go against the melodies, I'm sorry, I stopped caring about most of these songs. And you know, that's not helped by the lyrics either. Now let me stress that I tend to like Cage the Elephant's songwriting for at least being a little bit sharper and self-aware in comparison with some of their peers. But that doesn't excuse how very self-involved the writing on this album could be. Now thematically that kind of works, because the record can feel a little scattershot. You could argue there are elements about finding and taking control of one's own life, all with that sort of hard confrontational language that you would expect. But this record also seems very keenly aware that when it's done for its own sake or without love, that can feel hollow. Like the one genuinely nuanced track, How Are You True, where that self-involvement leads to a painful misconnection when a girl confesses real secrets, does everything that she's supposed to, but the guy's too wrapped up in his own world to care. But more often than not, you got songs like Too Late to Say Goodbye, which remind me of Hozier's Take Me to Church minus the biblical scope and power, where the guy's trapped in this bad relationship that then leads to disaster, which is later reflected on the very quieter Trouble. And most of these songs show guys who become more reliant or are seduced by some girl and it leads them to disaster. Mess Around is a lot of the same. And yet for as much as this record brings that alpha swagger, tries to emphasize and glorify it, it then undercuts it with Sweetie Little Jean, where the titular character is dumped by our narrator and then vanished, presumed kidnapped or dead, and then our narrator seems much more concerned with putting aside his own guilt than finding the real truth of the matter. It's an uglier side to this self-involvement, and again, it seems more self-involved than it should when the girl is dead. And then we have the final two tracks. The former called Punching Bag, focusing on a girl who was abused by her boyfriend finally getting some violent retribution. And while I liked this song done in the past in Theory with Karate by Brad Paisley, I never get a sense that this girl would ever tolerate this when she's described in the very first line as a stone-cold straight-faced killer and lover. And putting aside the questionable choice to coach so much of this album in violent rhetoric if you want to include a song like this, the bigger issue comes on the next track, Portuguese Knife Fight, when you get a hookup described in the exact same violent rhetoric, but it's very cleanly idealized and glorified. It feels very dissonant on a tonal level for across this entire album. It doesn't really come together for me. But then again, the more I went through this album, the more it feels at odds with itself, embracing hard-edged language only to then undercut it, production that seems to want to go a little bit wilder, headed in by some other production in other areas, and a very underwhelming vocal performance. And while I'll give this album some credit for recognizing its own two-faced nature, Cold 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 does this especially, and hell, the album's title seems to admit some self-awareness and asking the audience, tell me I'm pretty, try to go for that additional glorification when you shouldn't need it. It doesn't exactly make for a pleasant listen or one I want to go back to. And it's not an album I found very easy to repeat either. Again, it found more problems every single time. In short, I wanted to like Tell Me I'm Pretty by Cage the Elephant, and I can appreciate some of the ideas here, but it feels undercooked musically, and I definitely get the feeling the songwriting could have used a few more drafts to really hit harder. This is not a first take sort of album, Dan Auerbach. So for me, I'm thinking a 6 out of 10, and I guess a recommendation. But if you're a big fan of Melophobia and you don't like Modern Black Keys, this album will not be for you. Otherwise, I don't know, it's worth a listen, but they've definitely done better, and this was a disappointment. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yeah, sorry this review's a little late. I've had a real pain in the ass trying to record this properly. But if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And once again, keep in mind this is only my opinion. If you liked it, good for you. Not taking that away from you. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.